Thank you. Thank you, Lonnie, for those generous words. I'm really honored, really honored to be here with all of you. First thing I would like to say good morning and good afternoon for all of you who are in different places around the globe. And I would like to express my most sincere gratitude to the conference committee, but especially to Joe Jude and Lonnie Roll for this wonderful invitation. And it's just amazing to be here, and I'm really humble to be here presenting for all of you as an early career researcher. So also a special thanks to the conference committee and the Southern Utah University and all the team behind the event. As they were mentioning, it is wonderful to see how our community is adapting to new challenges. And this year we have, for the first time, a hybrid conference. So thank you for all the hard work preparing this first of its kind event. And finally, but not least, I just want to thank you all, the ARNA community, for being here today and for having been my inspiration and my critical participatory community since my early years as an action researcher. What I will present today represents many of your voices, learnings, and knowledges. And I hope my talk does justice to our past conversations to expand future frontiers, reviewing forgotten histories, and exploring alternative possibilities and opportunities for change, as the theme of this conference states. I would like to start my talk today situating myself in the complex colonial matrix of power, as Quijano calls it, placing who I am and from where do I present today. I am certainly part and parcel of the colonial domination, at the same time as I have experienced many embodied oppressions myself. I was born in the south of Spain, raised and educated by historical amnesia and post-colonial ignorance. My teachers only had worship for the imperial times of my country and those of Europe over other civilizations, besides the patriarchal norms forced upon my gender body. My past education and life in Europe was and continue to be an unlearning process. But this unlearning process was probably impossible without my South African life. 7 years ago, I moved to South Africa, an incredibly complex and loving space. There I realized I was white for the first time, but a different kind of white from the one I knew in Spain. Strange enough, if someone would have asked me then who was white, I would have quickly replied the Guiris, a term we use to define Northwest Europeans who come with uncountable 50-euro notes and spend their days under the sun enjoying the luxuries we will never enjoy in our country as nationals. However, realizing my whiteness and my privilege in South Africa, together with my countless intersectionalities, was a process in itself. It was uncovering what I meant in this new context and what my European educational system and my society ignored about racism, sexism, colonialism, and neoliberalism as phenomena interlinked. How I had embodied all this privilege as part of my being, and how all this had incredible power to determine my present and future opportunities to flourish. Negotiating these tensions has been without a doubt, and continue being, the most challenging task of my life. And that is why much of my academic work has been trying to deal with these uncomfortable and confrontational spaces of course imperfectly, as a white European woman, but as an ally. Thus, in my talk today, coloniality is central to my argument, but also central to the knowledges I uncover through this process, and those which I now strongly endorse as my new and constantly changing positionality. Hence, I believe it is important that we place participatory research and our different traditions as not relegated from these global challenges and our often complex positionality, but as integral parts of it. Let me start narrating part of what I would like to call the single story, but especially looking at what Chimamanda Adichie warned us about the danger of the single story in order to challenge the one dimension of research, and more importantly, participatory research, as accommodating Western standards, but also as universalizing the idea of the good and sometimes the unique participatory research for all. Certainly, we cannot overlook what the word research means for many communities around the globe, and the incredibly hideous practices which has been done on the name of sciences. Smith was not wrong when she clearly linked research with European imperialism and colonialism, reminding us how scientific research was used to humiliate and dehumanize local communities, such as measuring mental capacity of local communities with millet seeds, the darker tone of the skin, or the thickness of the hair. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity, as she claims. Inquiring over the other was part of a cosmological project, the formation and establishment of a single story about former colonies and their peoples. Colonies, as we know, were understood to be inhabited by savages under an irrational, unorganized, and inhuman world, and this conception was understood as opposite to the modern world and developed Europe. It established a threshold between those recognized as humans and those who were not. A being son and a not being son, which extended to objectifying the other as mere objects of colonial research projects and theorizing. However, the single story is not obviously formed by isolated representations here and there, but rather as part of a social and political project to push a single understanding of what research is, who is authorized to do it, and from where. This imperial, hegemonic, and cosmological project is often referred as the 0 point, or the universal worldview inspired by the Cartesian ontological rift. It provided a compendium of laws that organize nature and human beings as detached from body and context. It is, as Castro Gomez sustains, an imaginary position of those who claim neutral objectivity for themselves, an unseen position that presumes to see it all. And the creation of medieval universities was, as whole confirms, an act of enclosing knowledge, limiting its access, controlling it, and forming a small elite as its custodians. Knowledge was removed from the land and from the relationship of those sharing the land. Moreover, we can say that this single story about research is not something of the past, but rather an important matter today in a neoliberal and post-colonial ethos. Research has been and continue being an instrument of power. And as Mignolo eloquently claims, our current challenge is to avoid the modern expectation that there is a world that carries the true meaning of the things instead of the form of consciousness and the universe of meaning in which the world means. Meaning is not a true value, but a reflection of cognitive force and import within particular geopolitical designs. Nevertheless, and despite the degree of amnesia and ignorance, perhaps not so much epistemicide, we can talk later about that, over other knowledge systems, decolonial scholars also suggest that the critical point does not lie in discrediting Western knowledge as it is. It is a question of critiquing its European male, white, heterosexual, Christian, and neoliberal imperial construction and imposition on the rest of the world as a unique and universal knowledge, including its research practices. It is situating it and placing it. Keeping distance, as de Sousa Santos reiterates, does not mean discarding the rich Eurocentric critical tradition and throw it into the dustbin in history, thereby ignoring the historical possibilities of social emancipation in Western modernity. It means, rather, including it in a much broader landscape of epistemological and political possibilities. It means exercising a hermeneutics of suspicion regarding its foundational truths by uncovering what lies below their value phase. All this confirms that decolonial thinking and research matters, especially when we understand decoloniality and decolonial research not as the absence of coloniality, as Mignolo and Walls attest, but rather as the ongoing serpentine movement towards possibilities of other modes of being, thinking, knowing, sensing, and living. That is, and otherwise in plural, as a compendium of stories and not a story. However, said that, we know what a single story looks like for research, but what about our single story as participatory researchers? What is the single story told in participatory research? The reality is that besides the many practices and terminologies we all use to apply participatory research in different and diverse sectorial areas, many of us function in a strict and technocratic institutions and therefore embody their logics as parts of them. Their operational systems are often not dissimilar, being them universities, international organizations, or local NGOs. And they force us into embodied negotiations and often accommodation of participatory practices to the methodological and research approaches generally supported, leaving little space for exploration, innovation, and transgression. In many cases, our only chance is to adapt conventional tools or focus only on tweaking the methodological section of our research projects, which has been assimilated or born within these colonial and technocratic inflexible notions, which end up telling one story among many others, the one from the imperial economy. But one important aspect to consider is that research practices are not static, as one might extrapolate from a simplistic view at decolonial literature or my presentation today. It is not a totalizing perspective. Research currents and participatory researchers are influenced by the time and context where they are born, and possibilities of transgression, even if constrained, are equally there throughout history. The origin of action research and what I often call as the industrial tradition might serve as an example. Lewin was trained as a social psychologist interested in human behavior and social change. That is why he used quasi-experimental studies in factories, exploring productivity, participation, work absenteeism, or even changing food habits in the US. His methodology was based, as you know, on cycles of action and reflection that would act as a catalyst towards social change, but to desirable aims. And that is why Adelman corroborates questioning desirable aims for who, that Lewin's ideas on democratic participation in the workplace did not include any critique of the wider society, particularly the range of the economic relations between the worker and the employer, capital and labor. Indeed, a fair observation will be that although Lewin and his co-workers demonstrated the efficiency of action research for improving productivity, they did not develop conceptual structures that took explicit account of the power bases that define social roles and externally influence the process of any change in the modes of production. In this case, we can say that action research was framed by the circumstances of that time, allowing for different possibilities that were not possible until then in this particular context, and influence often in positivist and naturalistic approaches of human behavior. Action research was created and reproduced in a specific epistemological and ontological world of possibilities, and therefore adapted to the discourse, practices, and ways of accepted research then. However, a different view will be presented if we talk about action research today, and the diversity of forms this methodology and research approach has taken in the last 80 years. However, as much as we have been trying to diversify and transgress our practices, our dreams seems to have fallen deaf ears. Interestingly enough, Huron and Reason proposed a participatory paradigm back in 1997 as a way of filling the gap in traditional paradigmatic and academic lines, but also as reaching an agreement towards a flexible worldview and operationalization when applying participatory practices. In 2011, this was formalized by Lincoln, Leham, and Guva as the postmodern, in between brackets, and participatory paradigm. Nevertheless, this open-ended, innovative position has been able to do little against hegemonic logics. The paradigm was relegated to a secondary dimension where the name was more important than the form and internal coherence. We have ended up claiming a plurality of stories as our aspirations guide us towards it, but we have been utilizing a predominantly invisible and zero-point participatory story. A story which is in itself not the wrong way, but that it is only narrating over and over again a small part of the whole. As Viswanathan confirms, participation fundamentally accepts the expert definition of knowledge. It seeks only to modify or soften it. It seeks a blend of expert knowledge and ethnoscience. But it is a world where expert knowledge is presented as high theory and the lay person's ideas as a potpourri of practices, local ideas, and raw materials. There is no principle of equivalence. Furthermore, many more authors have warned us about this instrumentalization and commodification of participation, or as Higgins radically attests, action research has degenerated into a cure that might be worse than the disease. More importantly, are the substantial point raised by indigenous scholars, warning us about fitting in traditional approaches, even when we talk about qualitative research as the solution. As our participatory discussions are just fitting our research into the binary of using quantitative or qualitative approaches. In this case, COVID confirms for the case of indigenous research that there is a desire to give voice to indigenous epistemologies within qualitative research. Yet, those who attempt to fit tribal epistemology into Western cultural conceptual rubrics are destined to fill the squirm. Indigenous methodologies and qualitative research at best form an insider-outsider relationship. Although most qualitative researchers intuitively understand the dynamics of this relationship, it is here that we encounter the messiness of the work. The tension of the insider-outsider dynamic will persist until indigenous research frameworks have methodological space within academic research dialogue, policy, and practice. And here I want to say that there is not much difference between indigenous research and participatory research. The case is often the same. Are we trying to fit the unsuitable theoretically, methodologically, and ethically? What is clear then is that our single participatory story is often embodied within particular logics and practices that are project-based, technocratic, and immersed in this market ethos and instrumental relationalities. Focusing on methodological options without understanding local ways of research and how to go about research is telling only part of the whole narrative. And for those who are wondering that this only makes sense with indigenous communities, as I said before, in post-colonial context or in the global South, this is not the case. It also applies in Western contexts and communities. Cosmological diversity is everywhere. We ought to unlearn. It is a political and ethical insurrection, allowing the space for epistemological openness and overcoming the barriers and binaries between qualitative, quantitative operationalizations, theory and practice, and project-based operations, not as our unique way, but as a way to fostering pluralities. The substantial point is to recognize that the ontoepistemological ground of local communities matters beyond powerful academic and scientific paradigm agreements, because local language matters and the worlds that this language carries creates the meanings and the spaces for cultural translation and not necessarily universalization. And this is a conversation that we were having yesterday with the Initiative for Knowledge Democracy. As Mahmoud confirms, The terms people use to organize their lives are not simply a gloss for universally shared assumptions about the world and one's place in it, but are actually constitutive of different forms of personhood, knowledge, and experience. The way different communities perceive and investigate their world is important and significant to avoid a single story of participatory research. More importantly, as Eikeland reminds us, it is substantial to do action research as praxis research in ways that transcend intervening, collaborating, interacting, and applying mainstream research methods and scientific theory. So we orient our praxis research towards transcending, retaining, transforming, and improving at the same time, to raise something to a new level, mainly by recontextualizing it. The division between inhuman rationality, supported by science, and human irrationality as part of everyday life is a crisis of rationality, as Ballesta corroborates. It is the result of the embodiment of science in the common sense of the world, as the way confirms. A useful suggestion is that of Nanai, who recommend us to switch from a "they're all stupid" paradigm to a "we're all stupid" paradigm, where we can acknowledge our own epistemic gaps. It is assuming that each epistemic system is incomplete in itself and that we need dialogues among different positionalities to transform epistemic obstructions and gaslighting into epistemic humility and solidarity, being this always imperfect, incomplete, and full of uncertainties. It is an articulation of ecologies of knowledges, as de Sosa Santos calls it, which is the promotion of non-relativistic dialogues among knowledges, granting equality of opportunities to the different kind of knowledge engaged in every broader epistemological dispute, aimed both at maximizing their respective contributions to build a more democratic and just society and at decolonizing knowledge and power. It is about pluralizing from border thinking, so we don't support only a story or the story. However, although these ideas might be more than appealing for many of us, how do we understand or embody oppressive logics? How do we challenge all these divisions within inflexible systematic challenges? And how do we foster and promote many participatory stories in our praxis? In my search for fostering ecologies of knowledges and allowing a space for more than a single participatory story, I found many, many challenges. But also some hopes, and probably this is as many of you. First, open-ended frameworks has been generative as providing the space for recognition, self-determination, and dialogic operationalizations. But equally, when approaching from a particular ontological stand, always understanding this positionality as incomplete, flexible, and especially in constant contestation. That is why postcolonial thinking, feminist thinking, and the capabilities approach has been building blocks towards this methodological and theoretical experimentation with plural stories for me. Of course, not as the ideal and perfect positionality, because none will be, but as one that allows me to restore some stories, storing them in different ways from my past operationalizations. First, the capabilities approach allow me to recenter communities and groups from their own cosmologies, asking questions such as, what do the community or group have reason to value? But also, what do I have reason to value? And are these views aligned or not? And why? This, for me, is articulating what De Sousa Santos called the atopic hermeneutics. This is understanding the other without assuming that the other has the same basic self-understanding. But equally, the idea of reason to value in the capabilities approach is substantial in transcending the universalistic misrepresentation of rationality. This incompleteness, as Bonvin et al. State, is a means of avoiding parochialism, but equally broadening the notions of rational public debate and democracy beyond its Western definition and standard. It is a way to conceptualize participation beyond interventions and focusing more on democratic praxis embedded in cultural translations, not so much on participation. But also from a capabilities perspective, we have to add, do we have reason to value, to work together, to co-research together? And is our participatory or democratic praxis contributing to the lives we all have reason to value? This question is often reframed as, is our participatory practice or democratic practice enhancing the capabilities we have reason to value, or reducing the unfreedoms that impede us from being the person we want to be and doing the things we want to do? Examples of the capabilities approach uses capabilities, or what we say as effective freedoms, as its normative and evaluative point of reference. So examples of valued capabilities coming out of my praxis have been epistemic capability, Ubuntu capability, or healing and reparations capability. And they have all associated functionings, what we refer as the achieved freedom, such as being able to do something or be something. The Ubuntu capability for a group of students from a historically white university in South Africa meant being able to live with and towards others, to recognize our intrinsic connections with other human beings and our inseparable condition, being able to love, care for, and help others despite the difficult circumstances, just as we are loved, cared for, and helped by others to pursue our aspirations. Other epistemic capabilities for this same group meant, in terms of functionings, being able to use the senses to imagine, think, reason, and share our knowledge with others, and to do these things in a way informed and cultivated by a fair and less oppressive education. This must include our informal African knowledge systems and fair access to our formal Western education system, being able to use knowledges and use them to advance economic and other freedoms for our loved ones and for us. But also the healing and reparation capability for another group of students activists in this same institution was being able to critically understand the historical contemporary inequalities that the institution, in this case, or university, has sustained and maintains, and allow spaces to heal and develop reparations measures, not only at the physical level, but at the emotional and spiritual levels too. I just want to mention that the distinction between having the real freedom and achieving the freedom, the functionings, being able to, is an important one, as agency or embodied social oppression can intervene in the same kind of outcomes, misunderstanding the individual's and or group's particular situation. For instance, the fact that two members of my community are part of the community action organizations says little about the real opportunities to participate, to be part of it. One member of the community might be a male with financial security, and the other is a mother who has caring responsibilities. While we can say that both achieve the freedom to participate, the functioning in this organization, the real capability are divergent. And this matters in understanding the real effect power has over our opportunities and future aspirations, including our freedoms to investigate and theorize about the world from our own positionalities. On the other hand, feminist and post-colonial thinking pushed these capabilitarian questions, saying that the social conditions are essential to understand our embodied oppressions and how structures and agency are not separate entities, but they are in constant negotiation within the self. That is not only asking, what do we have reason to value, but why we come to value them? How are social, cultural, and political conditions determining what we have reason to value? Furthermore, they question the anthropocentric understanding of the capability approach, and in many cases, participatory research as well, highlighting the need to acknowledge and recenter other beings besides human beings. Combine these perspectives has helped me to put peoples and other beings, not necessarily humans, at the center and not as detached from their knowledges. But also it has provided me a generative space of cultural translation, especially through these valued capabilities, without merging on reducing views to a single story through dialogic praxis. Importantly, the capability approach is not aiming to agree on a universal ideal of democracy, even if democracy is central to the approach, neither an ideal list of capabilities, even though we have seen this in the literature, or a universal ideal of social justice. The approach in its open-ended operationalization looks at situations which leave individuals, considering this as beings or non-beings, with little opportunities and freedoms to exercise their resonant agency. Tackling the oppressive dynamics without discontextualizing them and the people's knowledges about their realities. An example is that of Matthias Crum discussing a list of functionings for the Wanganui River in New Zealand to preserve its own well-being, where he proposes to transcend the ethical individualism of the approach to an ethical ancestorialism, in which the river has capabilities as well as humans, and there is a negotiation between different beings in that particular cosmological space, in which their tension between the capabilities to promote the flourishing for both the human and non-human. It is an option, although imperfect, to foster multi-stories. And this has a lot to do with knowledge democracy and how we can create sensible and democratic grounds for human beings and other beings flourishing. When many of us think about knowledge democracy, many might directly think about open access, resources, and the free flow of information and knowledges. However, when we know knowledge is not aseptic as it pretends to be, neither objective as we have discussed, and democracy is an extremely contested term, knowledge democracy becomes a much more complex idea to debate for us as participatory practitioners. In academic discussions, knowledge democracy explore and debate power structures in knowledge production, such as reiterating the importance of diversity, the empowerment of the press, and the power of knowledge for taking action, as I have been mentioning as the beginning of my presentation. But we also have the contribution from Ho of the 6 principles of knowledge democracy, but these are similar to current debates, talking about the recognition of multiple epistemologies, about being attentive to social, creative, art-based ways of creating knowledge, the centrality of people's knowledges to political and cultural change, or the respect to the ownership rights of indigenous peoples and their own cultural and linguistic knowledge. However, although these proposals are incredibly powerful, I believe the capability approach might contribute to debates about the democratization of knowledges, and I would like to talk in plural, and participatory research, restoring some aspect, storing what is currently done, and story in an alternative and plural argumentative storyline besides the ones that we currently have. First, something central to the approach is the idea of democracy, as I was mentioning previously. It is the centrality of peoples and not necessarily their knowledges. And as I was mentioned before, people as referred to beings and not beings, more as those given personhood in a particular culture. So knowledges are constitutive of the personhood and not separated from people, their consciousness and their ancestors in many cultures. This detail is of importance for me and perhaps for some of us because it situates the well-being of beings above knowledge generation or detached knowledge. And this matters because in a neoliberal knowledge economy, knowledge is more profitable in market value than a person. And official knowledge comes with rights and properties often above the minimum dignity and value that many communities around the world have, having the danger to see beings as means for knowledge democracy and not the other way around. Let's think about the exploitative logics in academia through open access publications. We are at the service of the knowledge economy. It is the democratization of knowledges at the service of the well-being of multiple beings, being these people, trees, ecosystems, or ancestors. Knowledge plurality in itself might not, in my view, only be central about So knowledge plurality in itself might not be, in my view, the central aspect of knowledge democracy, but rather the beings of our planet making sense of what the world is from our different perspectives and what our aspirations are for a new imagination of the future. Moreover, this goes hand in hand with the critique that democracy has to be judged not just by the institutions that formally exist, but by the extent to which different voices from different sections of the people can actually be heard, as Amartya Sen contends. The democratization of knowledges has a lot to do not just by knowledge in formal and formal institutions as knowledge systems, and as knowledge as disembodied and detached entity, but with the diverse beings and their practices as carriers of these knowledges. But equally, when we talk about access to knowledge or knowledges, as we were mentioning before, we often think about open access publications, free documents for academic research, from academic research projects or institutional projects. The case is that these are important aspects of storing mechanisms for academic knowledge. But more importantly, is democratic access to knowledge as knowledge contributors. And this is, of course, a central worry as participatory researchers for all of us. However, more than researching or participating in a research project, the capability approach from this kind of radical perspective will be in terms of public reasoning, which leads to an understanding of democracy as government by discussion. More generally, in terms of the capacity to enrich reasoned engagement through enhancing the informational availability and the feasibility of interactive discussion. It is by creating dialogic spaces for cultural translation. Democracy has to be seen as also creating a set of opportunities for human and other beings, as Sen confirms. But this set of opportunities are through as real freedoms to be epistemic contributors through public reasoning and not mere receivers of these free epistemic materials. This dialogic and effective public space acknowledges the dynamic nature of the knowledges embedded in people's and non-human lifelong processes as ecosystems, as not final, but storing and restoring, but also the space to step back and ask, which freedoms do we have reason to value? And if we have reasons to value epistemic capabilities and freedoms. And finally, but not least, the idealism often used in knowledge democracy debates makes sense as an aspirational aim. However, it feels to me that shifting our view towards what is impeding the democratization of knowledges can be a more praxis-centered approach, conforming both practice and theory. Our social realities are not full of political victories against oppression. Neither sole justice aims or ideal scenarios. As much as ideal agreements can guide our way, they might end up becoming ends in itself, justifying inhuman consequences. It is then, do we need to agree on what knowledge democracy is in order to move forward as a collective? Are we considering what is being done for the democratization of knowledges in our communities, our houses, and our institutions? It is possible to build the democratization of knowledges from multiple stories, storing it not from a single and ideal narrative. I know somehow these questions and these debates are not entirely new, and I am conscious of the implications of ARNA in pushing this particular debates. So my intention is to reiterate the substantial importance of this for our future as participatory practitioners and our future creating a multiplicity of stories. Furthermore, I would like to close with more questions emerging from my presentation today. Questions in order to continue our ongoing dialogue. These are, is it still valuable to keep interventionist, project-based, or technocratic participatory practices as our main modus operandi? Is participatory research in any of its forms and practices different from knowledge democracy, methodologically speaking? Is participatory research one of the means to achieve the democratization of knowledges, or is it a constitutive part of it? Whichever participatory option we choose, it is knowledge at the center, or are human beings or beings at the center? What are the cosmological consequences and ethical implications of this? How could we avoid the anthropocentric trap, recentering beings in knowledge co-production when using humanistic and dialogic spaces? And this is quite important for all of us as participatory practitioners. And finally, but not least, what are our real freedoms to transgress our technocratic logics and institutions? How do we maintain and sustain insurgency without becoming a new hegemony and without polarizing over again? What I have presented today is a situated story, complemented with other stories which I had the experience to engage with throughout my academic and personal life. It is important because this story is not the story, as I mentioned, and it is an imperfect and incomplete and ongoing story. My pretension thus has not been to bring truth, but to share my own dilemmas, challenges, and uncertainties of participatory research and the democratization of knowledges with all of you. First, questioning certain knowledges, especially presenting global South positionalities on decoloniality, to unveil a main single and powerful story imposed, which is not new. I haven't said anything new about this, but also opening up towards other stories and memories of participation and the democratizations of knowledges that are neither new. I haven't said anything new, but I have provided an alternative point of reference through capabilities and the capabilities approach. Hence, I have told my knowledge democracy story. So now, which one is yours? Let us reimagine many dialogic, insurgent, and democratic stories where we create, as the Zapatistas said, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, a world where many will fit, and I rephrase, como una historia donde quepan muchas historias y memorias, and I rephrase, and a story where many stories and memories fit. Thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.